Hey guys, Will here. So today is a very exciting day for us here at Boosted Media as well as sim racing in general. We get to introduce a brand new ecosystem from Logitech into sim racing. So this is the G Pro series of products, the G Pro Direct Drive racing wheel and G Pro pedals. Now the focus of today's video is going to be the wheelbase. We hopefully will have the pedal review live at the same time as well if all goes to plan. But today we're going to be diving into all the details around the brand new Direct Drive G Pro racing wheel and find out whether this is the product for you. So let's go. Okay, so we've got a lot of stuff to go through today. Let's kick off with some important housekeeping stuff. So a big thank you to Logitech for sending across this kit for us to check out for review purposes. Now we will be referencing quite a few other products in today's video as well. It's important that you guys know that every single product that we will be referencing in today's video has been also sent to us for review as well. Now, if you do decide that you want to pick up any of the products that you see in today's video, including this new Logitech stuff, there will be some links down in the description below. Those are affiliate links and they're an absolutely awesome way of helping support our work here at Boosted Media at no additional cost to you. But it's important that you guys know that Logitech have absolutely no control over what we're saying today. They don't get to see the video before it goes live, and everything that we are showing today is purely our own opinions and observations. So let's start off here today by talking about compatibility and pricing, because this new Pro tier ecosystem certainly isn't cheap. There's a few things that you need to understand about compatibility straight out of the box here. So as you see behind me, there are two retail packages available. You've got your PC and PlayStation version and your PC and Xbox version. Now, the bases are actually different, although they appear mechanically identical, at least externally, between the two different versions. But if you try to plug the PlayStation version wheel into the Xbox base, it will only give you PC compatibility. It won't let it work on PlayStation. And conversely, if you plug the Xbox version into the PlayStation base, you're only going to have PC compatibility there too. So it is a little bit unfortunate that you are going to be locked into either the blue or the green camp, depending on what base you buy. But it does make sense from Logitech's perspective. Obviously, there are limitations when it comes to licensing, and I assume that that also opens up the possibility of having universal wheels available in the future that will work on Xbox or PlayStation, depending on which base you have, rather than which wheel you buy. It means they don't have to make two different versions of every single wheel. Don't have any more detailed information on that just yet, but that would be my assumption based off what we're seeing here. So to reiterate on that again, just to make it absolutely clear, if you try to use a PlayStation wheel on an Xbox base, only going to work on PC. If you try to use an Xbox wheel on a PlayStation base, again, only going to work on PC. Now, the pedals are PC compatible, either connected via the base or directly via USB to your PC. Whereas if you're on a console, you will need to connect them via one of these bases. As many of you guys will know, consoles will generally only recognize one external input device. So it does all need to be connected through the single connection, which means you kind of have to daisy chain through the base. Now, they have told me that there will be a solution for that later on as well, so that you can upgrade your pedals without necessarily upgrading your wheelbase. So say, for example, you own a G920 or a G923, you will be able to use the Pro pedals with those devices, but that isn't available at the time of launch, and I don't have a timeline for when that will be available. So just make sure you take note of that. Generally speaking, I recommend if you are on a budget, you want to upgrade your pedals before you upgrade your base, so definitely something that you'll want to consider. Now, pricing wise, the wheel package, which comes of course with the base, the wheel, and all the other little ancillary components which you need to get up and running. In US dollars, you're looking at $999.99, 1,099 euros, or if you're in Australia like we are, $1499.95, so 1,500 bucks. The pedals come in at 349 US dollars, 389 euros, or 599.95 Australian dollars. So definitely not cheap, but as you will see in today's video, there is definitely a massive step up in quality over the likes of the older G923, G920, and G27s, for example. Now, with regards to pricing as well, Logitech tell me that this is only going to be available through their online portal. And as I said before, we do have some affiliate links down in the description if you do want to help support the channel at no additional cost. They don't plan to sell this through traditional bricks and mortar retail, at least to begin with. And they also aren't going to have any online resellers to begin with as well. Now, I did ask the reasons for that. They told me that the reason for that was to just try and make the price as low as possible. There may be other factors involved as well, of course, but that is what I know. Now, because there is so much to go through with this new ecosystem, the primary focus of today's video is going to be on the PC side of things. I will do a separate video where we'll put this through its paces with Xbox Xbox and PlayStation systems to see what the experience is like and whether I feel like it's good value for money for a console user. But today we will be focusing on the PC side of things. So let's take a more detailed look now at this direct drive wheelbase. So I'm sure the number that a lot of people will be focusing on is the peak strength, which is 11 Newton meters. That places it more than 4 times stronger than the Logitech G920 and G923, which comes in at around about 2.3 Newton meters. So definitely way stronger and a very different experience from what you would be used to if you've experienced those kinds of products. But there are some key advantages when it comes to the design of this motor being direct drive over what you get from the likes of a belt or cog driven wheelbase, as are the majority of other console compatible devices. So at a fundamental level, direct drive means that your hands are connected directly through the wheel to the motor shaft itself. So there's no cogs, there's no pulleys, there's nothing else separating your hands from the actual motor. Now, the first thing that most people notice when they fire up a direct drive wheelbase is that it's almost completely silent in operation. This one does make a little bit of noise with the active cooling, as well as some of the high frequency tones that you get through the TrueForce technology, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. But generally speaking, it is extremely quiet in operation and definitely nothing like the jackhammer that you get with the other Logitech wheels that are on the market at this point in time. And that can be the difference between being able to sim race in an evening when you've got kids asleep, or your wife might be trying to sleep in the next room, maybe somebody's trying to study, or maybe your neighbors are constantly complaining if you live in an apartment block. So this could well be a game changer for that alone for you guys, as would be any other direct drive wheelbase if you're stepping up from a belt or cog driven wheelbase. Now, because your hands are connected directly to the motor shaft, that also means that there's no lash or play in the wheel at all. With a belt-driven system, it tends to manifest itself as a slight sort of dampening effect. So you get a little bit of flex or a little bit of give in the pulley assembly itself. And that overall means a loss of fidelity in terms of what you're feeling through the wheel. You can imagine if you've got the motor changing directions really quickly and it's connected to a belt, a lot of that really rapid movement is going to be absorbed and dampened by the belt itself and not actually come through to what you're feeling in your hands. Now, if you compare to a cog-driven system like a G923, for example, because there has to be a little bit of lash in the gears to allow them to move freely and not bind, you can imagine again, if the cogs are moving really rapidly and you've got teeth that are like that, little tiny subtle movements are going to just be taken up by the lash and not actually again translate through to what you're feeling in your hands. So direct drive means quiet operation as well as a lot more fidelity in what you're feeling fundamentally. Now, the other really important advantage of direct drive is the overall response time. So you can imagine in a belt or cog driven system, generally what's happening is they're using a smaller, weaker motor and using some sort of a gearing system to step that up. And that means trade-offs in either direction. So if you're running a small motor and trying to generate a lot of torque, that means that the acceleration or the top speed is going to be a lot slower. And conversely, if you want to have a high top speed or high acceleration, then the overall torque level is going to be lower because of the gearing. So with a direct drive motor, you get the best of both worlds. You get a fast response time, fast acceleration, whilst maintaining high levels of torque. And that is particularly true of a servo type motor like what we have inside the G Pro. So I hope that all of that makes sense. If you do have any questions, let us know in the comments and I'm happy to answer any questions there. But the important thing to understand is that peak force isn't the only determining factor in what the experience is going to be like with a wheelbase. If you're comparing 11 Newton meters on a direct drive to 11 Newton meters on a cog or belt driven system, the experience will be fundamentally different. Now, the elephant in the room, which we haven't talked about yet, is TrueForce. Now, you're going to see TrueForce talked about a lot in reference to this new wheelbase. Now, TrueForce was originally announced a couple of years ago now in conjunction with the Logitech G923. And look, their marketing was very aggressive around the technology. I did a dedicated video talking about how it actually works and how it compares to the 20-year-old now technology, which is generally used to generate force feedback effects on pretty much every other wheelbase on the market. And at the time, my take on it was that, you know, the technology definitely had legs, but it wasn't really fully realized with the technology that was available in the G923. Obviously, that's a weak cog-driven wheelbase. There's absolutely nothing wrong with the G923, and some of the fastest sim racers in the world, in fact, use products similar to that. So I'm certainly not saying that you need to have something like this to drive fast or consistently, but we'll get into that later on. But the point is that TrueForce was capable of a lot more than what could be realized with the G923 at the time. And I kind of felt like they shot themselves in the foot foot, to be completely honest with you, because they made it out to be this amazing game-changing thing. And my honest opinion is that it just really wasn't when it came to the G923. So if you want to understand the ins and outs of exactly what TrueForce is and how it does, I'll link a video down in the description as well as above my head for you guys to check out, where we go through all the details. But what I want you guys to understand at a fundamental level here is that TrueForce on this wheelbase is nothing like it was with the G923. In the context of this wheelbase, it is generally something that adds quite a significant amount to the overall racing experience. And I guess the best way to describe it is when I switch it off, I immediately miss it, which I wasn't expecting, and certainly wasn't the case with the G923 when we tested that. So just to give you the quick rundown on what TrueForce is, it's a proprietary API or application programming interface, which allows game developers to generate new effects, which you'll feel through the steering wheel, which weren't available through this standard old direct input, which I mentioned before is over 20 years old now. So assuming that TrueForce is fully and properly integrated into the game that you're playing, it means that the data coming out of the game, or the telemetry, is able to be read at 1000 hertz or 1000 cycles per second, and it's actually processed on board the unit itself at 4000 cycles per second or 4000 hertz. Ultra low latency as well, so there's not going to be any delay in terms of what you're feeling versus what you're seeing on the screen, which is excellent. And in my experience with this wheelbase, there has absolutely been no issues with latency whatsoever to speak of. So depending on developer integration, of course, it uses a combination of audio and telemetry data to generate the effects that you're feeling through the wheel. So that means that things like not only road textures, grass textures, ripple strips, but even subtle changes in track surface. So as the track rubbers in, or the temperature changes, or your tires begin to wear, all of those details can be felt through the base, provided of course that the game integration is there. So even though TrueForce has been around for a number of years now with the G923, I think that now that this wheelbase exists, game developers will really pay attention, and there's a lot of potential things there which they can implement with TrueForce which simply haven't been done before. So very exciting, and I think a big step forward for sim racing in general. Now, I'm sure a lot of people are going to be wondering about this quick release. It does look quite similar in its external appearance to the Fanatec quick release, or the QR1 system, but I'm happy to say that there are some significant differences there which do make ease of use and potentially longevity as well. Obviously, we can't talk too much about longevity because we have only had this base a couple of weeks, but there's absolutely no flex or play in the quick release itself, which is great. And it is also very, very easy to install and uninstall wheels too. So you can see here, we've got a paddle on the back here, which we can pull into release, just like what we have with Fanatec. But unlike with Fanatec, you can see I just slide that on. It slots straight into place with one hand. The base didn't even skim across the desk, and it's not even bolted to the desk. And then to release it again, all we need to do is just pull on the little collar. Now, you can't easily do this with one hand if you have this properly mounted. It's just a little bit awkward on the table here without having it fixed, but we just pull on the tab, and it just slides off like so. So you can actually see internally here, it's got quite a similar design to that of the NRG style quick release that we see with SimMagic, ImSource, and Mozza, but the external appearance is very similar to Fanatec. Now, the other thing that you'll notice here as well is we've got some little pogo pins which are spring-loaded internally here as well. So we shouldn't have any issues with snapping pins like some people have had with the Fanatec QR1. But also, if we spin the base around so Tom can see it with the B-roll camera, this whole mounting surface here is also floating. You can see it can rotate left and right. It can push from side to side as well. So a very well thought out design here that, again, obviously we can't comment on longevity just yet because we haven't had the wheelbase for all that long, only a couple of weeks, but I don't foresee any serious issues there with regards to wear and tear. I think that's a really clever design here. It should completely avoid anything like metal fatigue. So yeah, really impressed with the quick release so far. The other important factor here as well, they have used lightweight materials throughout the entire shaft assembly and the quick release on the back as well. The less rotating mass you have, the more fidelity you're going to feel in your force feedback. At 11 Newton meters, it's probably not going to have a huge impact like it would on a weaker direct drive wheelbase, but obviously the lighter, the better with regards to that. And we will talk about weights and dimensions a little bit later on in today's video as well. But yeah, really impressed with the quick release. One other thing that you will notice too, if you buy one of these, is unlike other direct drive wheelbases, which can rotate infinitely, this actually does have some mechanical bump stops at 1080 degrees. Now, the reason for that is that they're using a clock spring design to actually get the wiring and electronics through to the face of the hub. Same as what you'd have on a steering wheel in a real life car if you've ever pulled one of those off your car. So rather than using a wireless system like you see with the Fanatec or Moza systems, or a slip ring like you get with the Moza R5, for example, this is a clock spring design, which means that they do need to have a mechanical limitation to the rotation. So just something to keep in mind. It's not going to impact most sim racers, but if you are doing truck simulation or something like that, just keep in mind you will be limited to 1,080 degrees of total rotation. Now, a couple of other quick things to go through with the base before we take a more detailed look at the wheel, and of course disassemble this to take a look inside. You'll notice at the top here there is some shiny piano black plastic which wraps around the whole front face. This entire section here is basically an air intake. There is a cooling fan in the back which draws air through, I believe. I think it's sucking in from the front and blowing out the back, but we'll see that when we open it up a little bit later on. You'll notice some little dots here on the front face. That is a 10 RGB LED rev strip. One of the things that I really like about this wheelbase is the attention to detail when it comes to integrating things like that. You'll notice there's absolutely no bleed in those LEDs at all. The black edge is really, really clearly defined. And just throughout the entire design, even though it is a plastic construction, the attention to detail and the quality really is absolutely fantastic. And we will highlight a couple of key areas where that stood out to me as we go through this part of the video. So below that, you've got a little OLED display as well, very similar to what you get on a lot of the Fanatec wheels these days. And that allows you to display not only dynamic telemetry data from the game that you're playing, and obviously that will depend on the game that you are playing, but also access a settings menu. And that is really, really important because it allows you to adjust settings on the fly so that you don't have to Alt-Tab out of the game on PC. Now, of course, on a console, you don't have driver software like what you had on a PC. So it means that you are generally limited with wheelbases on a PC to only the settings that can be adjusted in the game itself. Whereas on this, you can actually access this settings menu and fine tune some of the settings at a device level in addition to what you can adjust inside the game. Now, the other thing that you can do with this menu as well, and you'll see this later on in a bit more detail, is also switch between 5 different profiles. So if you've got different settings for different vehicles or different games, you can switch between those again easily on the fly without having to Alt-Tab out of your game. So a couple other little details on the front here. You've got the little button here which accesses the menu. You've got your start-stop button here which turns on and off the wheelbase. It's just a momentary switch. So you tap it once, it switches on. You tap it and hold it and it will switch the base off. That does obviously sit behind the wheel when the wheel's mounted, but it's far enough away that you shouldn't have any issues with bumping it. And I certainly haven't run into any issues accidentally bumping it and switching it off. Down here you can see a little cover which removes to make way for the table clamp, which we'll talk about in just a minute too. So spinning the unit round to the back, we've only got a couple of inputs and outputs to talk about here. On my left-hand side, your right-hand side, you can see the DC power jack. That purely just connects through to the DC brick like so. That is a, for those who might be wondering, it is a switch mode power supply, so it's compatible with 100 to 240 volts AC, so that will work anywhere you are in the world. And it outputs 48 volts at 6.25 amps, which equates to 300 watts. So pretty hefty power supply there. On my far right-hand side, your far left-hand side, you can see the little USB micro connection. That is for connecting through to your PC or console. Now, interesting that they went with a USB micro rather than a USB-C. I'm not sure what the reason for that is, but one thing that I do want to highlight here is the fact that you do get a special cable here, and you can see that that's keyed. So if we actually plug that in to the wheelbase quickly now, that actually slots into the plastic there. So it provides somewhat of a strain relief there. It just means that if you step on the cable, it's going to likely tear the cable before it damages and tears the USB connection off the motherboard inside the unit itself, or the breakout board, I should say. So a good design there. And these, again, it's just these little attention to detail things that I think make a big difference here. Now, next to that, you can see 3 USB ports. Now, that is using a proprietary protocol. So what that means is that you can't just use it like a USB hub and connect anything that you want. The reason for that, I believe, is due to console licensing. They obviously want to maintain control over what you can and can't connect so that they can maintain a consistent user experience and not have compatibility issues. So even though they look like standard USB-A ports, and they are, it is a proprietary protocol. Hopefully we'll get a little bit more information over time on exactly exactly what accessories will be compatible with this. And as we mentioned earlier on, if you are using this on a console at the time of launch and you want to use the G Pro pedals, you will need to connect them via these USB ports on the back to use them with console. If you are on a PC, then you can connect the pedals directly through to the PC or connect them via the wheelbase. The advantage of connecting via the wheelbase is that you can adjust some of the parameters relating to the pedals directly through the settings menu that we talked about a moment ago. And that is pretty much everything in terms of inputs and outputs. You can see the unit is quite an interesting design here, as I mentioned before, drawing air in through the front. And I can actually see from the back here, the fan is facing that direction. So it's drawing air from the front through to the back. As I mentioned earlier, plastic construction in terms of the external appearance, other than the little mounting area on the bottom. So in terms of physical dimensions, it is a bit of a weird shape here. And one of the things that you will need to consider is the footprint overall, because it will block some of the view if you like to have your screen mounted low. And again, we'll talk about that when we get up on the rig a little later on. But length is 290 millimeters, width is 305 millimeters at the widest point, 200 millimeters high, and the base weighs in at 7 kilograms. And you can see I've removed the little port cover here off the front to make way for the table clamp. Now, something that really did impress me was just how sturdy this table clamp is. So you've got 80 millimeters clearance vertically and 40 millimeters clearance horizontally here. So you can imagine if you've got this mounted to a table that has some sort of a lip on the edge, as long as you've got 40 millimeters clearance there, so this is sitting up against a flush surface, you should be absolutely right. Now, the thing that really surprised me about this table clamp is when you pick it up, it does feel relatively plasticky and doesn't seem like it's going to be super strong. But we actually had this mounted on our Next Level Racing GT Elite cockpit using the table clamp because of some clearance issues, which I'll talk about in just a minute. And it was absolutely well and truly up to the task of handling the 11 Newton meters of peak force with no issues to speak of whatsoever. So I would absolutely say that this is sturdy enough to mount on a table. And obviously if you've got a hollow core table, then it's probably not going to be ideal. But if you've got a nice solid table, you shouldn't have any problems using the wheelbase to its full potential without the need for a cockpit, which again, as an attention to detail thing, I think is absolutely fantastic. The fact that they include this in the package, it is an additional expense, and the fact that you're able to get the full experience with the wheelbase without the need to buy anything else is really fantastic. So the way this mounts is you simply tilt the base up, slot it into position, and there's actually some little indentations there which slot into these little ball bearings, or spring-loaded ball bearings, so it pops in quite nicely. And then there's a couple of little grub screws which you can then reinstall in the base. Now, the other thing that I was a little bit concerned about is that this might get in the way of my legs. Obviously, it will depend on how you've got things mounted, but I did find that with the position of the pedals, I wasn't finding any issues with my knees bumping into this at all. Now, I mentioned earlier that the majority of the external skin of this is constructed of a nice high quality plastic, but if we flip over to the base here, you can see the exception to that is this 3mm thick piece of steel which bolts directly through to the main components of the internals, but also provides a nice solid mounting surface with some rubber feet here as well to minimize vibration on whatever surface you end up mounting this to. So a couple of important things to note here. We do have the exact same spacing for these two rear mounting holes as what you get with all Logitech's other G series wheels, so G27, G920, G29, and G923. There is also an additional mounting hole here at the front as well. So there isn't going to be provision for that for a lot of rigs that are on the market at this point. It's as simple as just drilling an extra hole if you do want to mount that though, which shouldn't be a problem for most people. One little issue that we did run into is that with our Next Level Racing GT Elite wheel deck, and it's not going to be an issue for every wheel deck out there, the issue that we ran into is that these two holes were sitting a little bit too far back on the wheel plate to accommodate for these tabs. And these tabs not being removable meant that the wheel was actually trying to sit up on top of the wheel deck like so, with the tabs sitting on top. So it would have been great if those tabs could be removable. You can see it's actually part of the same steel plate which has just been bent across and down. So if those were removable, it would make mounting a little bit more simple, but again, it's not going to be an issue for every single mounting solution. And as I said, we were able to use the table clamp to mount it onto that Next Level Racing GT Elite, and it was every bit as solid as we needed it to be, which actually really surprised me. So that is all good. Other important thing to point out as well is there is a angle set on the wheelbase of 20 degrees. Now it's going to look a little bit steeper than that on camera because obviously it's sitting on top of those tabs, but when you have it sitting flush on a surface or table mounted, you do have a 20-degree tilt in the wheel. And I think that is pretty much everything we need to cover in terms of the wheelbase itself. Let's take a look at the internals now, and then we'll move across and take a more detailed look at the steering wheels. Okay, so we weren't able to disassemble this quite as far as I had hoped. I did pop the little plastic covers off the sides and managed to get the back off and everything, but this plastic housing around the top of the unit here appears to have some little plastic clips on it, and I just wasn't confident to try and pop that off without breaking the clips. I could see a little bit in the back, and it just looked like those plastic tabs might break. But that said, we can see a little bit of detail of what's going on inside there. Let me just flip it back over again for you guys, and we'll just talk about what we can see. So you can see the cooling fan in the back here. That is suspended on some little rubber inserts, so you can see that can actually wiggle around independently, which acoustically isolates it, at least to some extent, from the rest of the shell. Means that any vibrations don't transfer through to the casing. As I was expecting, it is sucking air in through the front and blowing it through the back. You can actually see the entire motor assembly pretty much open inside the casing. So what's happening is the air is drawing around everything internally. You can see some braiding on some of the cables as well. And what appears to be the case is that everything that's pertaining to the motor itself is all bolted to this steel structure on the bottom here. So when you hard mount this, you're essentially hard mounting a plate with the motor bolted to that plate. And then all the rest of this plastic is purely just housing. So if I rotate the motor shaft here, if I hold it like that so you can see what I'm doing, I'm just rotating it like that. And you can actually see, as I turn that, the entire motor assembly rotating. At the very back here next to the fan, you can see the little clock spring assembly, which is what's responsible for passing the power and data through to the motor shaft so it can connect through to the wheel. So I think that is pretty much everything that we can cover in terms of hardware in lieu of popping that cover off. But overall, got to say, very impressed with the attention to detail that we're seeing here. Even though it is a plastic housing, it has an overall really well refined and high quality look and feel to it, at least in my opinion. Okay, so time to talk about these steering wheels. Depending on the package that you buy will determine which one of the two you get. As you can see, they're both pretty much identical. In fact, they are completely identical in terms of their ergonomics. The only difference being you get an Xbox button and Xbox layouts labeled on the Xbox version, and you guessed it, PlayStation button and PlayStation layouts labeled on the PlayStation version. Otherwise, they are absolutely identical between the two, no other differences. So let's just set the Xbox one aside to declutter a little bit here, and let's run through what we have here. So 300mm diameter, which is nice and versatile for a wide variety of different driving styles. Would have liked to have seen a round wheel rather than D-shaped wheel. It is a relatively shallow D, but a round wheel is always better for drifting and rally style driving where you want to be able to slip the wheel through your hands, but we'll talk about that later on when we go for a drive in a little bit more detail. Leather binding around the steering wheel as well, and that is genuine leather that actually smells like genuine leather too. In fact, your hands actually smell like leather after you've used it as well, which is a nice touch, at least for the first little while. And when you open the box, you're actually greeted with that smell of rich, genuine leather, which is always nice and something that I've always loved about even Logitech's cheaper wheels. And my G27 still smelled like leather after like 5 or 6 years, I think. So they're obviously using a nice high quality leather for these wheels. You can see little perforations here as well, good quality stitching throughout. We've got 10 push buttons around the face plus the PlayStation or Xbox button. You've got a little digital hat switch here as well, which is an 8-way switch. So left, right, up, down, and diagonal in each direction. No push button functionality on that, but it's got a nice feel to it, relatively nice and clicky. Again, nothing to get particularly excited about, but it does work. No rotary encoder functionality there, which some people will miss if you've been using a Fanatec wheel in the past, but we do have rotary encoders here on the side as well as on the face, and those are both push buttons too. Now, in case you're wondering, this isn't a horn button, it is just a sticker that is stuck on the front, and the stud pattern here is a little bit strange. It's a 65mm spacing between. Standard steering wheels that you buy in the aftermarket are generally 70mm, so you're not going to be able to just bolt any wheel that you want onto this button face. Obviously, you'd have to accommodate for the switches and drill holes in the wheel anyway, so it would be a little bit tricky. Now, you'll also notice that the button plate that sits behind the aluminium rim here itself is actually recessed so that the rim fits into it perfectly. So not really a wheel that's going to be easily moddable in terms of just bolting aftermarket rims on, although I'm sure there'll be plenty of aftermarket options available that will be custom designed specifically for this wheel. And we actually have a couple of aftermarket wheels to check out for the G920 and G923 coming up pretty soon on the channel, so excited to see that. So we'll leave ergonomics aside for now until we're up and running on the rig. Let's just flip around and quickly run you through what we have on the back. So we already talked about the quick release in detail. Don't need to cover that again. We have 2 analog paddles on either side. Those can be mapped to be a throttle, a brake, a clutch, and also a dual stage clutch too. And we'll explain how that works in just a minute. And then we also have 2 magnetic shifters on the back here as well. And those are using Hall effect sensors. So there's no mechanical switch or anything that can wear out and fail over time, which is a nice little touch. They've got a nice positive click to them with about 10 mil of travel for the shifters. And it is hard to sort of hold it in a midway position. As I've said in a few reviews now of wheels, I have a habit of if I've got a paddle that I can kind of pull on before it activates, I tend to hold it in a sort of halfway position when I'm driving, and then I often miss shift, whereas it's very difficult to do that with these. These are brushed aluminium all the way through to the pivot point as well. And the analog paddles have about a 20 millimeter throw to them. Plastic housing on the back of the rim here, but again, it is a nice high quality plastic that they've used. And the rim doesn't have any sort of echo or hollow kind of sound to it. It does feel nice and solid, and yeah, has a nice high quality feel overall, despite the somewhat plasticky construction. And that's one of the things that it's really hard to describe about this whole system, but despite the amount of plastic that we have on the hardware, it just has this overall well-refined and high quality feel to it. All the edges are nicely beveled everywhere. There's no sharp edges. Everything's just really tight tolerances. And yeah, really happy with everything in terms of the hardware. So let's jump in now, have a look at the software side of things and the all-important driving experience. Okay, so the wheel and pedals are mounted up on our Next Level Racing GT Elite cockpit. Now we do also have Next Level Racing's Motion Plus platform installed on this rig. Now that does introduce a little bit of side-to-side movement in the rig. So just be aware if you are looking at flex in the wheelbase, make sure you're using the rig itself as a reference point and not other objects inside the room. We're gonna talk about flex and things like that first here, including ergonomics. So we did reference this earlier on when we were looking at the hardware, but just to give you another look now that we're up on the rig here, because I know a lot of people will skip forward to this part of the video. The quick release mechanism actually does work really nicely. Now, having a look at the design, as you saw earlier, it is kind of somewhat of a hybrid between what you get with the NRG style quick release that you'll see on SimMagic, ImSource and Mozza wheels, but it does also closely resemble, visually at least, the Fanatec quick release system. But what I can tell you is that it does have a more refined operation than what you get with the Fanatec QR1 quick release at least. So if we slide this onto the base here, all we do is just line up the little arrow with the channel on the top, and the whole thing just slides straight on like so. You don't really need to put any effort into it to click it into position like you do with Fanatec. And you'll notice when we pull the collar as well, it literally just pops straight off. If you've ever used a Fanatec wheel, you'll find the first few times that you make the wheel, I actually hit myself in the chin and bit my lip really badly with one of my brand new wheels. Had to kind of really yank it, and then it came away and hit me in the face. Not gonna be an issue with this. Now, of course, there are gonna be some manufacturing tolerances. Your experience isn't necessarily gonna be exactly the same as ours, but I can tell you on all the samples that we have here, and I have 3 wheels and 2 bases, all of them do seem very uniform, and there's no issues at all with flex or play. You can see here, if I wiggle the wheel from side to side, the whole rig is actually moving relative to the ground, but there's no discernible flex in the quick release itself at all. Very, very smooth and no rattling or movement there. You can see when I pull up and down on the wheel, there is a little bit of rocking back to forward there, but that is the entire wheelbase and wheel deck having a little bit of flex there. As you guys saw earlier when we looked at the hardware, we are using the table clamp to mount it on this rig just because of those little tabs which locate it in place, not being fully compatible with this particular wheel deck. So let's move on and talk about ergonomics. Now, one thing that I noticed immediately when I jumped into the cockpit that I don't like compared to a lot of other modern direct drive wheelbases that are on the market now is just the overall size of the direct drive unit or the wheelbase. So when you're sitting in the cockpit, you do see a lot of it. If you're the sort of person that wants to have your screen mounted low behind the rig, it is going to block a large portion of that bottom half of the screen there. So that is one thing to just be aware of if you're comparing to something like a CSL DD or a Alpha Mini from SimMagic or a Mozza R9, for example. All of those have a much smaller footprint, which is going to take up less visual space in your field of view. Now, in terms of the wheel itself, there's a lot of things that I really like about what they've done here. And it's obvious to me straight away that they've really taken their time and put a lot of effort into perfecting a lot of little fine details that people may otherwise miss. So let's go through this in a bit of detail now for you. So firstly, 300mm, really good design choice here, gives you a good amount of versatility for driving a wide variety of different cars. Now, we have seen some weaker wheelbases come with smaller diameter wheels, which does give you a slightly stronger sense of the force feedback, but 300mm on this wheelbase is absolutely fine. It's going to give you plenty of precision for driving Formula style cars, GT style cars, all the way through to your street cars, rally cars, and so forth. One thing that I don't like about the design, which I wish manufacturers would stop doing, is if you've got a one-size-fits-all universal wheel that you're using for everything, please make it a round wheel and not a D-shaped wheel like this. Now, the D-shape is quite shallow, but if you're doing drifting or rally style driving, that D shape at the bottom just means that the wheel is going to catch rather than slipping through your hands freely like it would with a perfectly round wheel. So that is one thing that I would change for a one-size-fits-all wheel. Of course, subjectively, you may really like the D shape, but objectively, it does make the wheel less versatile than it would be if it were a round wheel. Now, the comfort and grip is all really nice as well, as we talked about earlier on, so we don't need to go over that again. Now, again, keeping in mind that this is designed to be a one-size-fits-all wheel to be used across a variety of different types of vehicles, I really like what they've done with the layout here as well. Now, one thing that I noticed immediately is the slight dish that they have on this wheel, and that's a really clever design, because what it means is that all of the buttons are slightly recessed from the flat face of the wheel. So if I want to spin that wheel through my hands, if I'm drifting, what that means is that I'm not going to be snagging or pressing any buttons or potentially snapping off any little hat switches or anything like that. So I really like what they've done there. That does include that little hat switch there as well. That does sit just slightly behind that flush surface. Now, you've got 4 buttons there which are easily accessible with your thumbs without taking your hands off the standard grip position. So if you want to set that to increase or decrease something like ERS, fuel map, brake bias, those kinds of adjustments, you can have a plus and minus for brake bias on one side, plus and minus for engine map on the other, for example. You could, of course, assign these to things like overtake, push to torque, DRS deployment, and so forth. But you've got 2 buttons here on either side which are easily accessible without rotating your hands at all. If you've got slightly larger hands than I do, you should be able to reach these 2 buttons on the inside with relative ease as well, without having to take your eyes off the road, which is nice. You've got your little hat switch here as well, which isn't a rotary encoder as we saw earlier, but that is relatively accessible too. It's slightly out of the way, so you're not going to knock it by accident when you're driving, but you can still rotate your hand around and reach that. So again, they put a lot of thought into the placement of all these buttons to make it as versatile as possible while still relatively simple to use. Then you've got the more complex controls down the bottom here as well. So you've got a rotary encoder down the bottom here. That also functions as a push button. You've got 2 additional buttons here, and same deal on the right hand side. You've got your 2 push buttons, rotary encoder with push button functionality. And once again, as we touched on earlier, they do have nice detents in those encoders, relatively easy to operate either with gloves or without gloves, which is always important, again, for a product which is trying to be as versatile as possible. We already talked about the shifters as well. They feel really nice on the rig. The paddles have plenty of throw available in them as well. So let's have a look at the settings menu on the wheelbase itself. So when we first turn on the wheelbase for the very first time, it's going to pop up and it's going to give us the option to select between Xbox or PC, or if we have the PlayStation version, of course, it's going to give us the option of PlayStation or PC. Now, if you are switching between platforms regularly, you can have it prompt you every time you start up, or if you're always going to be playing on the same platform, you can set it so it will automatically default to that setting. So we're going to go to PC. Now, to navigate through the menus, we can use either of the rotary encoders and then the push button on either one of these as well. I'm going to use the left-hand side here just so I'm not blocking the view. We're going to go into PC mode, and it'll run just through a little calibration here. You can see it tilts off to the left and just calibrates itself. And this is the default screen that you see here with a force gauge that you can see going across the top. We can see our gas, brake, and clutch. Now, if you have the G Pro pedals connected via USB, you won't see any reading for the pedals on this display. If they're connected through the wheelbase, as I have it here, you will see those readings come up. And you can, of course, change those default screens as well, which I'll show you in just a moment. So we're going to push the little button on the wheelbase just here to access our menu. And just like we have on Fanatec wheelbases, we have the option to choose between 5 different profiles. So we can click into this menu and we can choose between our 5 profiles or G Hub, which is based on the settings that we have inside the software, which I'll show you in just a minute too. So we're gonna leave it on the G Hub profile for now, but it is great that you can quickly change between profiles here on the fly. If you're wanting to change between cars in the sim, or you forget to change profiles before a race is about to start, you can do it directly from the wheel. And that's something that I've always really liked about the Fanatec ecosystem, so great that we have it here now as well. So we're gonna select our G Hub profile, and then scrolling down here, we have adjustments for our overall force feedback strength, our TrueForce audio, our force feedback filter, our dampener, our steering angle, our brake force, our left paddle adjustment, right paddle adjustment, clutch bite point, RPM mode, brightness, and then we get down into our device settings. Now I'm going to do a separate video where I'll take you through all those menu options in detail and explain exactly what each of those do. But for the purpose of this video, the important point is that you're able to change all the same settings here as you can do inside the Logitech G Hub software, which gives you complete control from the wheel itself without having to Alt-Tab out of your game to make adjustments on the fly, which is great. So under device settings here, we've got our home screen adjustment. So we have a dynamic screen. This is what I was referencing before when we're outside of the tuning menu. So in the dynamic screen mode, mode that will bring in data from whichever game you're playing as well. Now it is limited in its functionality at the time of making this video, but they tell me that they will be adding additional screens over time. But in the dynamic mode, it'll just pull in and display whatever the software is telling it to do. So we're gonna go back into the menu. One thing I don't like about the menu system is that you can't scroll back through to the bottom. You have to scroll all the way from the top to get down to those bottom options, but I'm sure that's something that they can fix in the firmware. So we've got the dynamic home screen, we've got the test home screen, which is actually what it defaults to if the game isn't outputting any telemetry. So that's what you guys were seeing earlier on. We've got a profile setting here as well. So that's gonna just display which profile you have selected. Go back down again. We also have an option for a torque display. That is gonna give you a live torque reading there, which is quite interesting, as well as average torque. And then if we go back down again, I think that is the last one. Let's go back. Yep, back to dynamic mode again. So that is our home screen adjustment. We then have a compatibility mode. So if you're playing a game which doesn't recognize the new G Pro products, then you can switch this to be detected as a G923 wheel, and that will allow this to work with any software that is compatible with the G923, which is pretty much everything these days. So it's just the two options there, Pro wheel, which is native mode, and then G923, which is compatibility mode. So we're gonna go back to native mode. And then under platform, this is the menu I was telling you about earlier, where you can have it ask you or prompt you to choose which platform you want on startup, or you can force it to be Xbox or PlayStation if you have the PlayStation wheel connected, or PC. So I'm gonna change that to PC now, just so I'm not having to do that every single time. So that is the settings menu as it is right now. They do tell me they'll be adding and expanding upon this in the future. But yeah, as you can see, it gives you everything that you need on the fly there, so you don't have to go and Alt tab out of the game to change settings, which is really, really awesome. So let's dive in now and take a look at the G Hub software. So the G Pro wheel and pedals both use the same G Hub software that most of you guys will be familiar with by now if you own any other G series products. So you can see here in the software package, my mouse, my power play mat, my G915 keyboard, and the Pro wheel are all showing up. Now I have the pedals connected through the wheelbase currently. If you connect them via USB, they'll show up as a separate device here. So we can access the settings menu from here. We can also download a firmware update. Now one little glitch that I've noticed in the software is at the moment it's constantly prompting me to update the firmware even though I have the latest firmware version on there. So don't go thinking that I'm not running the latest firmware for this review. I absolutely am, and I have verified that with the contacts at Logitech just to make absolutely sure, and I'm sure they'll fix that little bug in the future. So we're going to click on our G Pro wheel here, and we get a nice little visual representation. Quite a bit of input lag there. Thankfully, that doesn't translate across in any of the sim racing titles. So down the left-hand side here, we've got tabs for our wheel settings, our pedals, and you can see those are visually represented. And then light sync as well, which as you can see, lights up the LED strip across the top, which we'll talk about a little later on too. And you can see, again, nice little transitions here in the animation. It all just has that nice refined, you know, well thought out look to it, at least in my opinion. So let's go back to the wheel settings here to begin with. Now it is quite basic in what you can adjust here. What's important to understand here is that a lot of the effects that you'll be feeling through this wheel are generated using the new TrueForce API rather than the standard direct input API, which we see used on pretty much every other wheelbase on the market. In fact, all the other ones that I can think of. So what that means in a practical sense is that you're not going to see adjustments here that pertain to the standard direct input force feedback adjustments as you would see with some other wheels. Instead, it's all based around this new API. Now that said, there are a couple of things which I do hope they can figure out a way of adding later on, those being friction and natural inertia adjustments, but we'll go through all of that in detail when we get up and driving in just a minute. So under the wheel settings here, we've got an adjustment here for sensitivity. That is purely just relating to how much the wheel rotates inside the game relative to how much you're physically moving it here. We've got an operating range here as well. This allows us to adjust from 90 degrees all the way up to 1080 degrees. Now, a lot of other direct drive wheelbases on the market do allow you to go even further than this, which is great for truck simulation, for example. Because we're using a clock spring design for the quick release on this rather than a slip ring or wireless system, there is a physical limitation in the amount of rotation that we have available here. So you can see as I rotate it through 180 degrees, we do hit a mechanical bump stop here as opposed to a soft bump stop. If I let go of the wheel, it will spring back to the middle. If we wind that down to say 90 degrees, you'll now have a soft bump stop, which limits the range of movement there. So some people might like to feel a mechanical bump stop at the maximum amount of range inside the vehicle that they're driving. So say for example, a lot of GT style cars might max out at 540 degrees. So let's wind it up to 540. So in which case you would feel that physical limitation at 540 degrees. And that is all that's doing. An adjustment here for damper as well, adjustment for overall force feedback strength. You can see I've got that wound all the way up to 11 Newton meters, so I'm taking full advantage of the entire dynamic range available on this base. Then we also have an on-off switch here for automatic force feedback filter. If we switch that off, it gives us a manual adjustment. If we leave it turned on, what it will do is read the data rate coming out of the sim that you're playing and automatically adjust this to suit. And I do find that it does do quite a good job, generally speaking. And then lastly, under the wheel menu, we have a TrueForce adjustment here for the audio effects generated by the TrueForce API. So I found a setting here of around 50% gave me a good overall sensation, a good amount of immersion without feeling over the top and kind of grainy and just noise-like. So that was my recommended setting there. But again, this will purely depend on your subjective opinion and the game that you're playing. Now we do have some tooltip menus here as well for some of the key settings. So if we click on that guy, you can see it will pop up and tell us what that does. And likewise with all the other settings too, if you leave that enabled, it will pop up and explain those, as well as give you some adjustments here for some common settings. So we also have a tab here for dual clutch paddles, pretty much like every other dual clutch system on the market. So we can assign different functions to each paddle. So left paddle, we have the option for gas, brake, clutch, handbrake, axis A, or axis B. So if you do want to use this as a throttle and brake or a handbrake, if you don't have a mechanical handbrake, you can do so. Good options to have. Same deal again here with the right hand paddle. And if you have them set both to clutch, what you can do is pull both clutches in, and you can see on the gauge there on the right hand side with it set to 72% on the slider there. When I release my right hand, it'll go down to 72% clutch engagement, and then I can release that down. So in a practical sense, you would adjust this to meet the friction point of the clutch in the car that you're driving. And what that allows you to do is launch the car by just letting go of the first hand to get the car underway without any wheel spin, and then releasing the second stage to get completely underway. Now, one thing that I did notice here is it does only work in one direction. So you can see if I let go of the right hand, it goes down to 72, but if I hold on to the right hand and let go of the left hand, it does nothing. So again, I'm sure that's just a firmware thing, and they probably will update that over time. But as it stands right now, only the right-hand paddle operates to activate your second stage. So that is all of our steering wheel settings. We'll just quickly give you a look at pedals as well. We will cover this in more detail in our full pedal review, which will be going live around about the same time as this video. So we've got adjustments here for clutch, brake, and accelerator sensitivity, as well as a brake force adjustment here for the load cell in our brake pedal. Now, if you're running these pedals on the floor, you're probably going to want to leave this at around about 30 kilograms. But again, we cover this in more detail in our full pedal review. Then we also have an option here to combine the pedals if the game that you're playing requires that. Most games these days don't, but again, a good option to have just for that backward compatibility. I'm going to wind that back down to 60%, and let's move on to the light sync tab. So this allows you to set up custom profiles for the RGB LED strip across the top here. So you can see by default, we have a few different presets. We've got an outside in, which is going to go from the outside to the inside, an inside out, which goes from the inside to the outside, of course. We've got left to right, right to left, and then we also have custom effects here as well. So if we click on one of the custom profiles and edit, you can see we can set a custom direction here, as well as set a individual color throughout the full RGB spectrum for each of the individual 10 RGB LEDs. And we also have some presets here for vibrant colors, pastel, and mono colors to choose from too. So again, a very clean integration and very nice and simple to use. So I wanted to start off our PC driving tests here with a bit of a talk about TrueForce and exactly what that's bringing to the table, because you'll remember back when the G923 released, we actually did a detailed video, which I suggest you watch, explaining exactly how TrueForce works and what it aims to bring to the table. Now, admittedly, the launch of TrueForce in conjunction with the G923 a couple of years ago was a little bit underwhelming, and I felt at the time, and again, we mentioned this in our review of the G923, that it was kind of touted as this amazing game-changing thing that was going to revolutionize sim racing. And the implementation in the form of the G923 just left me at least a little bit underwhelmed. And I know a lot of people in the sim racing community felt similar about it. Really, it was just a G920 with this extra TrueForce thing, which when you use that in the context of the hardware which was available in the G923, it just really didn't bring all that much new to the table, in the form of, say, something that was game-changing. So the knock-on effect from that was that TrueForce kind of didn't end up being taken as seriously as maybe it should have been, because the hardware just really wasn't up to delivering the full potential that TrueForce brings to the table. So what I wanted to do here first is talk about exactly what TrueForce is actually bringing to the table in terms of the G Pro. So what we're doing is sitting in the pits here with the engine turned off. And I can tell you all the normal things that I look for in a direct drive wheelbase are all absolutely present. So there's no notchiness around center. I've got a good sensation of weight inside the car as well. That is one thing that does vary a little bit depending on the sim that you're playing because of the lack of that inertia and some of those other settings that we talked about earlier on in the video. But in ACC, you do have a good sensation of weight. There's no notch around the center. There's a nice smooth transition as well. Feels nice and weighty, and there's no sort of hint of torque ripple or cogging or anything like that at all. So, you know, a lot of other wheelbases on the market at around this sort of price point or even cheaper are, you know, just every bit as good as this in terms of those things these days. The direct drive market has really come a long way in the last few months. But with the engine off, perfectly smooth, and, you know, you really do get a good sensation through the wheel. Now, if we switch the engine on, what's going to happen, we'll get it started. I'm now getting through TrueForce a sensation of engine vibration through the wheel. Now, if you have TrueForce cranked all the way up, which I don't suggest you do, it does become a little bit overpowering. It does start to feel a little bit gimmicky. But when you wind it down to around about the sort of 50% mark here, in ACC at least, it gives you that good kind of texture underneath the wheel. So the wheel still feels smooth, but you're getting that slight sensation of something being mechanical going on behind that you don't get with other direct drive wheelbases that don't have TrueForce technology implemented. So that is definitely something new which I haven't really felt before, other than, you know, a vibration system or some sort of aftermarket system that's reading raw telemetry through SimHub or something like that. But actually having it coming through the direct drive wheel is something that is really cool. So let's head out here quickly. And I just want to quickly talk about what I'm feeling in terms of detail and how it varies from what I would feel on other direct drive weight bases like the R9 or the CSL-DD, for example. So immediately the texture in the road that you're feeling is a lot more defined, a lot more detailed. Little things like the sensation of going over the cresta as well. I actually felt the weight of the car get lighter through the steering as I went over, and that is something that you do feel through direct input force feedback. But what I really noticed that is, I don't know whether I'd go as far as saying game changing, because it's not adding anything that's going to make you faster, but definitely in terms of immersion, when I run up on those ripple strips, you get a lot more defined texture. And I think it's just down to the fact that this is running at a higher sample rate, being 1000 Hertz, compared to what you would normally get through the force feedback engine. So maybe not so much in ACC, because that runs at 400 Hertz these days anyway, but when I run over those ripple strips, rather than just relying on the standard direct input effects that you would get generated through the telemetry, I'm getting all this extra detail. So really getting a good sensation of the weight of the car transitioning, as well as the suspension compressing. So you get a good sensation there. Those are things that can be achieved with a high quality direct input wheelbase though, but really where it stands out is just the really granular detail. So if I hammer down the straight here, we'll pick up the pace now the tires are warm. Might put a wheel out on the grass as well, iRacing style, just down Conrod Straight here too after these barriers. So yeah, just immediately you feel yourself out on the grass. You get the compression of the suspension, so you get the car lurching around, but the actual texture of being off the track surface changes with a lot more definition than what I'm used to. And the result of that is just purely a deeper level of immersion than I've experienced before, outside of, you know, third-party things like motion systems, vibration, tactile feedback, and so forth. So the fact that this is actually able to deliver all those things through the wheel itself, again, I wouldn't go as far as saying game-changing, but it's definitely something that is adding a new layer that we didn't have before. And the reason why I'm saying it's not game-changing is because it's not something that's going to make you faster or more consistent. So, you know, if that's your priority, then, you know, this isn't a game changer. But if you're just looking for a great experience and something that's really immersive, all of the details that you want to feel are all there, just like they are with every other direct drive wheelbase these days at around this sort of price point, but with that extra detail that we didn't have before. So I'm just going to hammer up over the mountain again at higher pace now. Get it turned in. Really good sensation of weight in the steering as well. So, you know, 11 Newton meters is plenty enough for the vast majority of people, I would say. I normally drive it between 10 and 14 Newton meters, depending on what I'm driving, but as I've said in a couple of reviews recently, you don't want to get in a situation where the car's driving you rather than you driving the car, and I feel like 11 Newton meters is definitely enough to where you can feel everything the car's doing. You can see the back end of the car got a little bit loose there coming down the hill, but was able to catch it. Everything's nice and responsive. There's no delay or anything like that. And yeah, look, everything just gels and comes together really, really nicely. I gotta say, really, really impressed overall. So let's jump in. Let's talk more about our impressions across a broader spectrum of sim racing titles, see how things come together there, and then we'll wrap everything up with our conclusions. Okay, so over the course of the last week, we've been putting this base through its paces across a wide variety of different racing titles, from Assetto Corsa, Competizione, iRacing, Dirt Rally 2, we did F1 22, we did Automobilista 2. We threw pretty much everything we possibly could at the wheelbase in PC related context. We will be doing a separate video where we'll be putting it through its paces on console as well. I felt like that warranted its own video because it is an awful lot of money to be spending on a wheelbase for console use. But just talking about the PC experience for today, I think the thing that jumped out to me first and foremost was just the ease of use across all those various different sim racing titles, even to the point where when we launched Assetto Corsa Competizione, for example, detected it straight away, even had a default button mapping assignment put in too. So it was literally plug it in, load the game, and we're able to just jump in and drive straight away, which was really nice. And I think that is something that's important to a lot of people. You know, a lot of us sim racers are, you know, so far into the hobby that we actually enjoy the process of getting in and tweaking things. That's part of the enjoyment of the experience for us. But a lot of people don't have a lot of time to race and just want to jump in and get up and running straight away. So, you know, that can be the difference between getting 5-10 laps in of an evening between when the kids go to bed and when you go to bed, or potentially just sitting around and stuffing around trying to get things up and running. So I think that ease of use is going to be important to a lot of people. One thing I did notice is that it wasn't super consistent between those different sim racing titles. If you compare to, say, Fanatec, for example, that's one of the things I've always loved about Fanatec's ecosystem, is that regardless of the sim that you're driving, as long as your settings are relatively, you know, consistent, then the driving experience is relatively consistent across as well. And again, that's something that's important to a lot of people. You know, if you're jumping out of Assetto Corsa Competizione into iRacing, driving the same car, it should feel at least relatively familiar, and a lot of the muscle memory should translate across. Obviously, there are going to be subtle nuances between different sim titles. That's unavoidable. What I did find was that this wheelbase did require quite a bit of tweaking in some of the buried settings in each sim racing title to get it up and running and feeling consistent between those titles. But it was achievable. That's the most important thing. Now, I think a lot of that is purely just down to the integration of TrueForce, particularly in iRacing. That actually required digging around in the app INI file to really fine tune and get things feeling exactly the way I liked. I did find that out of the can, the experience in iRacing did feel a little bit too over the top with TrueForce. It did start to sort of cross that boundary between adding something to the experience versus just sort of adding noise. And again, as I keep saying, you want to be in a scenario where you're driving the car rather than the car driving you. And anything that is adding noise on top of that experience is taking away from the overall experience rather than adding to it. So it is a very fine line with TrueForce, and I do feel like you are going to want to dive in and take the time to really get that element or that extra layer of force feedback really dialed in. So over time, I do hope that we see that integration of TrueForce become a little bit more intuitive and a little bit more easy and straightforward, you know, just for those who don't want to be digging around in INI files and so forth to really get the most out of this wheel. I feel like particularly with iRacing, that is something that is necessary, at least at this point in time. But I gotta say, overall, the experience using the wheel was very good. Didn't have any issues with wear and tear in the time that we've been using it so far. Obviously, we haven't been using it for a long period of time, but that said, the quality that we've had with Logitech's racing products in the past has always been very good. I ran my Logitech G27 for 10 years and never had any issues with that whatsoever. So, you know, I'm sure that this is built to the same standard, if not higher, being a much more expensive product. So I don't anticipate any major issues, but obviously we will keep an eye on things. At the moment, it's a little bit of an unknown, but the quality everywhere I look does seem to be of a high standard. And I certainly didn't spot any red flags when it came to build quality throughout this review process. So let's dive into my more detailed list of pros and cons now for the Logitech G Pro steering wheel system. So first up, quality hardware despite extensive use of plastic, well refined overall with exceptional attention to detail. One thing that did jump out to me is just the quality of the plastics on the front face here. Very much I guess a smartphone-esque kind of product, something that, you know, you want to look at, something that looks nice in front of you. It doesn't have that kind of, I guess, industrial feel that a lot of other sim racing products do have. So some people will like that, some people won't. Now it might sound funny, but one particular thing that jumped out to me was just the clearly defined edges around the RGB LED rev strip. On a lot of other sim racing, most other sim racing products that we've tested at around this sort of price point, you get a bit of bleed between the LEDs. It just doesn't have that same high quality refined feel that we have here. So a little attention to detail, things like that, I think do make a difference to the overall presentation of the product. And this is something that I think most people would be proud to have on their rig, particularly if if you're stepping up from something like a G923, this is on another level and something that's, you will appreciate every single time you jump in. And whichever angle you look at it from, it does have a very clean, very refined look, despite its kind of edgy and angular design. So next on my pros list, the table clamp works really well, even at 11 Newton meters. I was worried about how that was going to stack up. The table clamp on the CSLDD, for example, I didn't recommend using that for anything over about 5 Newton meters. I felt like with the boost kit, you really wanted to have that on a more solid mount. Now, obviously it will depend on the table that you're mounting. If you're using a hollow core table or a really thin table, then you probably are going to want to have something more solid. But as you saw in the review video, we had it mounted with the clamp on our GT Elite due to not wanting to drill any additional holes. And that's something we'll talk about in the cons in just a minute. But yeah, the table clamp was absolutely strong enough to stand up to everything that we threw at it. And yeah, just really impressed with how well that functioned. So next up, a really well ergonomically designed all-rounder wheel. 300 millimeters is perfect for pretty much driving everything that you can think of. Do wish that it had a round bottom rather than a D shape. That would make it a little bit more versatile in terms of rally style and drift style driving. You do find that the wheel will bounce around in your hands if you're trying to slip it through your hands for drifting. So a little bit of a weird choice there, but otherwise very, very good ergonomically. I like that the buttons sit slightly recessed with the dish in the wheel as well, so you don't accidentally knock them if you are spinning the wheel through your hands, and just a lot of little attention to detail, things like that, which I think really goes to show the amount of effort that they put in to refining this product. The magnetic shifters are relatively quiet as well, which is something that will be important to those who are wanting to race next to a bedroom or somebody studying, or maybe in an apartment block. Yeah, definitely something that I appreciated greatly. One thing I was a little bit disappointed with though was just the feeling of the push buttons on the face of the wheel. The rotary encoders are really good, but the push buttons are kind of, I guess, equivalent to Fanatec's cheaper, more entry-level wheels, so not up to Club Sport standard, for example, more like the CSL Elite range. So again, for a product of this price point, I would have expected more out of the buttons. You will get used to it, but it certainly isn't up to the same standard as you get on a Fanatec Club Sport or Mozza wheel, for example. Next up, absolutely love this new quick release design. Obviously, we'll need to see how it stands the test of time, but so far, absolutely no issues. We didn't have any play in the shaft or anything like that. And I do like the design they've gone with here with pogo pins and that floating assembly that we saw in the front of the hub there to reduce wear and tear or any chance of metal fatigue over time. Definitely an improvement over Fanatec's QR1 system. And so far, from what I can tell, at least seems to be on par with what we get from the likes of Mozza, SimMagic, and ImSource with that NRG style quick release. So now we get into the more driving experience focused stuff. Almost silent operation with TrueForce disabled. Now, anybody that's used a belt-driven or cog-driven wheelbase in the past would know one of the biggest caveats with those is just the amount of noise that they generate. It makes sim racing next to a bedroom or somebody studying almost impossible. This is pretty much completely silent with TrueForce turned off or turned down. If you do turn up TrueForce, you'll start to get some of that sort of resonance going on. You'll start to actually hear the engine vibration audibly. No different from what you would have with some sort of transducer or speaker-based system though. High frequency vibrations do generate sound waves, and it's just something that is unavoidable, but definitely not something that I would say is excessive with the wheel, and not something that you're gonna hear with headphones on. The stronger you have the forces turned up, the more you're gonna hear it, and that is just simple physics, so not really avoidable, but otherwise absolutely silent operation. And then getting into TrueForce, so I've written TrueForce aside, the wheel performs every bit as well as its competitor products, so we're looking at, say, the CSL-DD, the Mozza R9, and SimMagic Alpha. I haven't tested the Alpha Mini, unfortunately, so I can't comment on that one. But yeah, in terms of the refinement, the smoothness, the amount of granular detail that you get, every bit as good as any of those products, which actually surprised me being a first direct drive product from Logitech. Although it has been in development for a long time, I wasn't sure just how good it would be out of the gate, but every bit as good as those products, which was a pleasant surprise. It's smooth and dynamic with a good analog feel and no notchiness or torque ripple at all to speak of. But I think really the star of the show here is TrueForce and what that actually does genuinely bring to the table with the G Pro. Now, we mentioned earlier the fact that, TrueForce was very much talked up, very much, I guess, marketed as a game-changing thing for sim racing back when the G923 was released a couple of years ago. And it really didn't live up to the hype, at least in my opinion, with the G923. That is a different story with the G Pro. What I've written here is TrueForce's potential is realized with this wheel, unlike with the G923, which didn't really live up to the marketing hype. It does genuinely add a new layer of granular detail that I've not felt with any other direct drive wheelbase in the past. And while these are sensations that can be added with other third-party transducer products, these are more complex to set up. They require third-party software like SimHub, for example. And the fact that this does everything all in the one package, you just plug it in and it works. Of course, notwithstanding the tweaks that are necessary to really get it dialed in some of the sim racing titles, as we mentioned earlier, it really does genuinely add to the overall immersion that's offered by this wheelbase. So it's probably not gonna make you faster or more consistent, but it is a genuine step forward for sim racing. So then on into our list of cons, again, not in any particular order. Already mentioned earlier when we were talking about the quality of the wheel, the buttons are a little bit underwhelming just regarding the push buttons on the front here. The rotary encoders and the shifters and analog paddles are all absolutely fine. Only 1080 degrees of rotation available, unlike other direct drive wheelbases. As you saw earlier, that's because of the clock spring design they're using to get the power and data through to the wheel, as opposed to a slip ring or wireless system. So if you are playing truck sims and such like, just be aware that you will be limited to 1080 degrees of rotation, unlike every other direct drive wheelbase that we've tested to date, which can go much higher than that. Lack of options to increase wheel friction and inertia. This wasn't an issue in the majority of sim titles that we tested, but in iRacing, I did wish that I had the ability to just crank those up just to give you a little bit more sensation of the wheel being mechanically connected to a steering mechanism. Would prefer a round wheel in lieu of any other options being available. That's just, again, simply because drifting and rally style driving can be a little bit tricky with the wheel bouncing around in your hands and not being able to slip through easily. The wheel is absolutely fine for what it is, but given that it is the only wheel available for this platform at this point in time, a round wheel would have been a better choice in my opinion. So moving on from the wheel to the base, not a huge fan of the large footprint here. I do feel like it's unnecessarily large when you compare it to the likes of the CSL DD, Moza R9, Simagic Alpha Mini, for example. Those are all a lot smaller. It means that you can have your screen nice and low behind the rig and not have the wheelbase itself taking up that valuable real estate. Next up, the little locating tabs that we looked at earlier, which are integrated into that metal base plate on the bottom of the rig. Those aren't removable, which means that you will be limited in how you can mount this on some wheel decks without drilling extra holes. As you saw, we were able to use the table clamp and it was absolutely fine. We could have just drilled new holes. We just didn't really want to do that. Now, those tabs are important because they do keep it from rocking back and forth when you are table mounted, but it would be nice if they were removable somehow, just to make mounting a little bit more versatile. And just lastly, with regards to driving experience, I did feel like the TrueForce integration varied a little bit more than I was hoping between the different sim racing titles. While the underpinning force feedback was pretty consistent overall, TrueForce was just a lot better in some titles than it was in others. Absolutely outstandingly good in ACC, for example, and a little bit underwhelming without some intense tweaking in iRacing. And as we mentioned earlier, in the case of iRacing, it did actually require going into the app INI file and finding those TrueForce settings in the list there to really tweak them. I don't know why those aren't integrated into the UI. I'm sure that they will be at some point. I'm sure that Logitech will absolutely be pushing for that. If not, a lot of the sim racing community that buy these will be pushing for it. But yeah, it just wasn't as intuitive as it should have been. So in conclusion, again, with regards to PC use only in this video, would I buy this over other alternatives? Look, it's a really tough call here. I think that this does have a lot of things going for it. It is quite expensive as well, though, compared to a lot of the competition in the PC racing space, at least. So we've got the Moza R9, we've got the Alpha Mini, we've got the CSL DD, which is Xbox compatible, the GT DD Pro, which is PlayStation compatible. You know, those are weaker in force feedback. The extra 3 or 4 Newton meters is definitely noticeable and something that I did appreciate with this wheel. I do generally drive with between 10 and 14 Newton meters of peak torque, even on wheelbases that have a lot more torque available than that. So I did find that I did make use of the full dynamic range available on this wheel. And I definitely did personally appreciate that extra torque over what's available on the Moza R9 and the CSL DD with the boost pack. But of course, depending on how strong you are, will ultimately determine just how important that is to you. Now, it feels funny saying it because this does use a lot more plastic overall than all of those other competitor products that we've mentioned. But I do feel like this has a slight upper hand when it comes to the overall refinement and build quality just throughout the entire package. It's a smartphone quality product, whereas a lot of those other products that we've mentioned are a little bit less refined, a little bit more rough around the edges. And while they may use, aluminium and metal in their construction, they just don't quite have that same quality feel that this has, at least in my opinion. And it does feel funny saying that, given that this is a plastic product compared to a metal product, but that is my honest impression. So look, my honest opinion is this: I think that this is a lot of money to spend when there aren't any other wheels available at this point in time to use with this product. I'm sure that that is something that will change over time, and we'll definitely be keeping a very close eye on this. I would struggle to spend the money right now unless I was perfectly happy with this wheel for every style of driving that I do. But I think if you're purely focused on one type of car, I mean, I look back to my earlier days in sim racing where all I was doing was just driving one particular style of car. And in that scenario, I would have been absolutely fine with this wheelbase, and I would have been absolutely blown away by it and absolutely happy with it. So, I have to kind of try and look at this from other people's perspective too. But for me, it is an awful lot of money to be spending whilst there's only one wheel available. But wheel situation aside, I do genuinely feel like this would probably be my choice of wheelbase compared to the other products that we've talked about in today's video. And that's purely just down to the ease of use. Obviously, console compatibility is great too, and we will be looking at that in the next video. But yeah, look, overall, it's just a really excellent, well-refined product. I do feel like TrueForce genuinely brings a new level of immersion to the table that I haven't felt in a wheelbase before. As I mentioned earlier, those are things that are achievable with aftermarket products, transducers and whatnot, but having it all in the one package is definitely something that is appreciated. It's going to make the ease of use a lot higher. And I'm really, really looking forward to seeing where Logitech go with this new ecosystem. If they can bring out a range of wheels relatively quickly, I think that this is a very, very, very strong competitor. And I'm sure that if you buy one, you will absolutely love it to bits and won't be disappointed. So I think that pretty much sums up everything for today's video. Thank you guys very much for watching. If you do decide you want to pick one of these up, we do have some affiliate links down in the description below, which is an awesome way of helping out the channel and our work here at Boosted Media at no additional cost to you. So we really appreciate your support there. If you want to look at any of the other competitor products that we mentioned in today's video, we have detailed reviews of all of those available at boostedmedia.net as well. So check that out. But thank you very much for watching, guys. Leave a thumbs up if you've enjoyed the video, and I will see you again very soon. Bye.